Hi, this is Dr. Marks, and our topic for today is using data effectively, something that is very important in the field of economics. First, let's talk about why we might choose to use data. Of course, economists rely on data for all kinds of different illustrations. It might be a simple single statistic. For example, maybe I'm talking about gross domestic product for some year 2013. That would be one single statistic and not necessarily a set of statistics, but I might also choose to turn data into a chart or a graph. And when I turn data into a chart or a graph, that's going to allow me to look at trends. So maybe I'm going to show GDP going up or maybe GDP going down over time. So in economics, we might talk about inflation. So maybe we're showing, hey, if I look over time, I'm starting to see this trend towards having inflation in the economy. Of course, the nice thing about charts or graphs is that we can see multiple observations in one place. So one of the things we're going to talk about in this lecture is using charts or graphs to efficiently communicate a lot of data at one time. So one example, I do research on stuff related to Virginia schools, and maybe I'm looking at enrollment, and I want to communicate what enrollment looks like at a whole bunch of different schools in Virginia. Well, I could turn that into a chart, and that would be one way to efficiently communicate that, or I could create some kind of graph where you'd be able to look at and see that some are big, some are small. You get the idea. When we use data, it helps us to educate people, it helps us to motivate a certain idea, or maybe we're trying to justify our position. Data is incredibly handy. But one thing that data does is it moves us out of what we call the normative. When we talk about normative things, when we make normative statements, these are our opinions. And so when I'm talking in the normative, it might involve a value judgment. So something about how I think the world should look. So maybe I think that people should be asked to do something, or no one should be allowed to do something else. Of course, these kinds of ideas can't be tested. So when I talk about things that are normative, we can't subject them to any kind of rigorous testing. We can't use the scientific method. And that means, of course, we can't prove them to be true or false. So normative statements, value judgments, our opinions, how we think the world should work, and things that obviously we cannot test. Generally, we want to be speaking in the positive. Now, there might be exceptions to that, but positive statements are not our opinions. So these are going to be things that are testable. It might be that they're conclusions from theory or models. In economics, we use a lot of theories, we use a lot of models. And so if I use, let's say, law of supply or law of demand, or the idea of supply and demand graphs, if I use those to generate a conclusion, then that's probably something that's positive. Things that are positive can be confirmed true or false. One way I might do that is subjecting them to, looking at data. So data is going to be involved in positive statements a lot of the time. So normative, value-based, positive, they're going to be testable. So unless an assignment specifies you to give your opinion, you should probably write in the positive. So I always tell students that, look, if you're asked to write a piece about your opinion on gun control law or your opinion on abortion, then obviously you're being asked to write in the normative. But in economics, we more often than not write in the positive. We might ask our students to specify what they think we should do in terms of monetary policy. That might be their opinion, but really we're asking them to use what they've learned in terms of the tools of economics, the models of economics, to then lend kind of the scientific method to some kind of scenario. So unless you're told otherwise, you should probably assume you're being asked to do something in the positive. Now, let's look at some examples. Consider the following statement. Longwood University is not doing a good job attracting students. Let's say somebody says this, Longwood University is not doing a very good job attracting students. Well, that does sound like an opinion, right? So if it's an opinion, we all agree that we can't really test this. Now, I might be able to test things kind of like this, but this particular statement, I don't know really what doing a good job even means. How do I define doing a good job? And how do I test that when it's not clear what we really mean by that? So hopefully it's obvious to you that this is a normative statement. Let's look at another statement. Data shows that Longwood's enrollment has fallen by 6% in the last year. All right. So doesn't that kind of sound like what we said before? Before we said Longwood's not doing a good job with admissions. Well, now we're saying something that's a little more constructive. Data shows that enrollment's fallen. Maybe that's what I mean when I say Longwood hasn't done a good job. So what we've done is we've used data and we've taken a statement that was normative and we've made it positive here. And of course, it's a similar sentiment, but I can do something with this. This is now testable, right? So I can use statements like this, where I've got data, and I can use them to defend a position. Now, maybe my position is normative. Longwood's not doing a good job. Well, if I'm going to say Longwood's not doing a good job, I need to back it up with some information that's positive. And I should use that positive point, for example, fall of enrollment by 6%. And then I might be able to defend my normative positions. Now, again, these are all fictional, by the way. Longwood's enrollment hasn't fallen by 6% to my knowledge. I just wanted to give you some examples you'd understand. Let's talk about sources of data. And I know you're familiar with the term primary sources. Primary sources, of course, are good. When we talk about primary sources, we're talking about sources that provide first-hand information. And so an example might be the U.S. Census Bureau, right? Somebody's out there and they're literally collecting data. They're either going door to door, might be a data collection method, or they're surveying people, or they're asking people to fill out a form and send it in. But the U.S. Census is primary information, right? The U.S. Census Bureau runs that census, and they are responsible for collecting all of that data. So the U.S. Census literally collects data firsthand from households in the United States. So we can all agree that that's a primary source. Of course, then they can take this data and they can compile some reports and make them available to the public. So we understand primary sources. Those are going to be the sources where data has been collected firsthand. But we also have secondary sources. And those secondary sources might use data from another source to then do an analysis. And so a lot of times researchers like myself don't generate the data ourselves. We might use somebody else's data to do that. So maybe I ask you to read a study by some guy named Smith in 2018, and he used data from the World Bank. Well, he didn't generate the data himself, but he generated the analysis based on somebody else's data. So that would be a secondary source. Finally, we have tertiary sources. And tertiary sources are basically summarizing others' work. And so they may not be doing any analysis themselves, and they're not doing any data collection themselves, but they're basically providing a compilation. So a good example of a tertiary source would be Wikipedia or an encyclopedia. I know you're like, well, what is this you speak of, encyclopedia? Well, when I was a kid, we'd go to the library and we'd pull out these huge volumes of encyclopedias and flip through pages, and we'd have to read them that way. Of course, now you can find all kinds of information online. But Wikipedia doesn't collect data, right? These are people summarizing other people's stuff. And of course, they're not necessarily doing an analysis with somebody's data. They're basically collecting a lot of information and summarizing it for us. So with respect to data, again, primary source, the one who's collecting the data. The secondary source is the study that then uses that data. So I take somebody else's data and I do some kind of analysis with it. And as we said, the tertiary source is the summary. Of course, where we really want to go, probably for this class's purpose, is the primary data sources. I'm going to be asking you to collect data and incorporate it as a way of kind of justifying certain points that you make. Now, secondary sources can be good too. We're probably, for our purposes, going to be going right to the source and trying to collect data and information from those who have collected it. Again, as I said, I'm not trying to say secondary sources are bad, because somebody doing analysis with somebody else's data, well, that's valuable too. They've definitely broadened our education on a certain topic. Just make sure you're clear that we probably want to avoid tertiary sources. Now, encyclopedias might be okay for certain things, but for our purposes here, we want to get our hands wet. We want to kind of dive in and think about where we get data. So we're really looking for those primary sources. This is a Wikipedia entry related to gross domestic product per capita. So you see a whole bunch of listed countries, and you see these dollar figures next to them. Basically, they're looking at what is kind of the average per person income. That's basically what that GDP per capita is capturing. And it's basically listing a whole lot of data here. But what Wikipedia is doing here in this example is it's summarizing data from 3 key sources. So this really wouldn't be a good source for us to use. I know your professors have said over and over again, Wikipedia is not a valid source. You should not be going to Wikipedia because anyone can write a Wikipedia entry and you don't necessarily know that it's accurate information. Well, this one looks like it's probably accurate because they've taken data from the primary sources. But what we need to do is go to those primary sources, and those primary sources are revealed to us right here. So he's taken, or it could be a she, whoever authored this has taken information from the International Monetary Fund, which collects data, and from the World Bank, which collects data, and the Central Intelligence Agency, which collects data, and it reports kind of rankings of GDP per capita from 3 different sources. And you see they're not always the same. If you look on the left, you got Qatar number 1, and then you got Qatar number 1 for World Bank, but CIA has Qatar number 2. All right. Nevertheless, my point is that while the Wikipedia site might give you accurate information, we really need to go to those primary sources. So where can we go to get good data? Well, one thing that I really like, if you've never used it before, is the CIA World Fact Book. This is a great place to go for country-specific data. And so whatever country you're looking for, they're going to have a really large profile. And you can look up information country by country. And this isn't just for economists. You can get an overview of much more than just the economy, although they do a really nice job of summarizing economic information. For example, you can get information about the governmental structure and geography. They have a section on religion. You can get information on mortality rates. You can get information on access to clean water. Again, lots of different information. CIA World Fact Book. So here's what a page on the CIA World Fact Book looks like. This particular one is for Thailand, and you see that there's an introduction. They give an overview, geography, people and society. So that's probably the section where I'm going to learn about religion, government, the economy. I'm going to be able to learn about average income levels. We're going to understand more about the poverty rate. It probably goes over imports and exports. We've got a section on energy, communications, transportation, military and security, and other transnational issues. Having trouble getting that out of my mouth. Transnational issues. So again, the CIA World Fact Book is a great place to go. But there's also a lot of agencies and banks that collect a lot of data. And so the World Bank, if you've studied any international economics, you've learned a little bit about the World Bank and their role. And we've got the International Monetary Fund, and of course the Federal Reserve Banks, our central banking system in the United States. They do a lot of research and a lot of data collection. They publish a lot of reports. Of course, then there's government agencies, and these could be federal and state. They produce a lot of work as well. So we could be talking about the Bureau of Labor Economics. We could be talking about the Environmental Protection Agency, the Bureau of Economic Analysis. So there's a whole lot of different agencies that have people working and using data, producing data. And so again, they do a lot of primary data collection, but they also do secondary data analysis. So it's not all primary, they do secondary stuff as well, but there's a lot of great information in these types of sources. You can look at some really big reports. For example, Economic Report of the President is going to give you a very large overview of all kinds of budgetary issues, lots of financial data there. Nonprofit agencies collect a lot of data, and this is where we might see some interest in environmental stuff. So maybe we're doing a project and we need to get a sense of, state of the environment in certain places. So the Worldwide Fund for Nature, we've got Sierra Club, you've got Greenpeace, you've got Natural Resource Defense Council, you've got the World Wildlife Fund. There's so many of them. So again, nonprofit agencies are a good place to go. But you also have research institutes, and they do a lot of work as well. Again, some of what they do is collecting primary data. Some of what they do is analysis where they might not only use their own data. So that might be some secondary sources. So some ones that we look at a lot in economics, the Brookings Institute and the Cato Institute. So again, so many different places, but one thing you need to think about is evaluating your source. Is it a primary source? Is it a secondary source? Or is it simply a tertiary source? And we really want to stay away from those. Let's talk about the idea of bias in data. Clearly, we want to avoid bias in our data. That does not make for very solid research methodology. So what I mean by that is that we want our data to be representative. In other words, we don't want to design our data collection simply to support our hypothesis, right? Maybe I have a hypothesis and hey, I'm clever enough to be able to find a way to make sure my data supports our hypothesis, but that would not be good scientific method, right? That would not be good data collection, design, and methodology. So we want to make sure that when we think about our data collection, that we're not skewing it to try to support our hypothesis. So we need to ask if our data paints a fair or an unfair picture. We want our data to paint a fair picture and one that is, accurate. So, does our data paint an unfair picture? Does it paint a picture that is inaccurate? Those are important questions. So here's the idea that data has to be selected in a way that it's not going to have this subjective perspective. And so when data is selected in a way that has a subjective perspective, then we have selection bias. And I'm going to give you some examples. So maybe I use a sample of data that doesn't really reflect the population as a whole. So if I'm grabbing a sample, so maybe I'm grabbing Longwood students. Well, when I grab Longwood students to survey them, I need a sample that's representative. But what if I grab a sample that's not representative of the population as a whole? Well, that would be selection bias. So maybe my data is selected non-randomly. So maybe I'm trying to grab people that give me the survey responses that I want. Well, that's not good data collection. So this could be manipulation. Maybe I'm manipulating the people that I survey or the people I collect data from so that I can push my own agenda, so that I can kind of promote my own subjective perspective, my own opinions. But we also need to understand that selection bias can result from simply not being careful. So if I'm doing a study, and right now I'm doing a study where we've surveyed students about their opinions about classroom group work. Some people like it, some people hate it. More often than not, they really dislike it. But I have to be careful to survey a large number of students, and I need to make sure that those students represent the population. So let's say that I am trying to survey a bunch of Longwood students about how they feel about group work. Well, if I'm trying to promote my own agenda, hey, group work's great, then I'm going to try to find those students that would have had maybe better experiences with group work. So maybe I find those honor students that only have worked with other students they know who are also honor students, and maybe they've had a better experience because they haven't had other people taking advantage of them because they all know each other and they're all good students. Well, if I only survey those students, then I'm not kind of randomly picking these students. I'm manipulating my data set, and it's not going to be representative of the whole Longwood population. You get the idea. So let's look at an example. Let's say that Longwood reports that the average SAT score for freshmen is 1200. And that would be really impressive. And people would look at it and go, wow, that's really impressive. Okay. But what if, to get that data, they only looked at students in the honors program? And of course, they're not going to do that. That would be highly deceptive. But what if they did that? What if they said, hey, let's just grab those honor students because that data is available. It's sitting here on my desk. I'm going to quickly just calculate the SAT. Oh, it's 1200. Well, obviously, we all know that's probably not going to be an accurate representation of the average student. So what that has done is manipulated the data in a way to make Longwood look different. That would be selection bias. What if, as a second example, I survey people to find out their attitudes about the current president, but I survey mostly Republicans? Well, very likely Republicans are going to have a different opinion than Democrats. So if I really want to be fair, if I want to get kind of a non-biased kind of view, if I want to really reflect the population, I need to have a large number of people, and I need it to be balanced. I need all kinds of different people: Republicans, Democrats, people who vote for independent parties, and then I have eliminated the selection bias. But if I only survey the Republicans, I have introduced selection bias, right? Example 3. Let's say that I report data on suicide rates, but I'm trying to drive home some point that I want to make, so I select the years with the highest suicide rates. Well, would that be fair? Would that be painting an accurate picture? No. And we see this kind of selection bias where people might generate statistics where they've kind of picked and choose. They've cherry-picked the statistics that most benefit them for their point. And so the kind of selection bias that you're most likely to have as you go forward with presentations for this particular class would probably be example 3. And that would be, if you're going to report data, you need to report data that's fair and accurate and not kind of just cherry pick data that might be outliers. For example, maybe in year 2017, there was this spike in suicide rates. And before that, they were lower, and after that, they were lower. Well, if all I do is report that 1 year with the spike, would that be accurate? No. So I need to be fair in the data that I present to make sure that it's kind of painting an accurate picture that's not deceptive, that doesn't introduce selection bias. All right, you get the idea. So let's move on to talk about tables. Tables are clearly useful, of course, only if they're well constructed. I know you've seen some studies where these tables are just like out of control, they're hard to follow. That's not worth anything. So we're talking about well constructed tables, and that means making sure that they're not too complex. If a table's too complex, then it doesn't really help communicate anything. Tables, of course, should, if at all possible, fit onto one page. And so I had a student turn in something the other day, and it had a table that went on for 5 pages. And I said, you're, out of your mind. Nobody wants to see a 5-page table. You're going to have to figure out a way to break it up into different subtables or something. But certainly you're not going to turn in a 5-page table. That's insane. Of course, if you have a 1-page table, you want to make sure it doesn't split across pages of papers or slides. So if you're writing a paper and you have a 1-page table, then you want that one table to all be on the same page, not have it cut between pages. So just think about that. That's really just a formatting issue. Of course, we need to indicate sources, even when we're using data to create our own tables. So let's say when I'm using somebody else's table or somebody else's chart. So maybe I'm doing something about endangered species and somebody put together a great table or chart on that and I want to use that. Well, that's fine, but I need to state where the table is from. I can't just use somebody else's work without citing it. Obviously, that would be wrong. If I don't cite it, then it's technically plagiarism. So it'd be just like taking somebody's words and not putting a quote and citing them in a paper. So I must indicate my sources. When I'm using someone else's table or somebody else's chart, I need to state where the table came from. And that helps me avoid plagiarism. Now, I also need to indicate the data source when I'm constructing my own table, right? If I have my own table, but I'm using somebody else's data, well, that's also a place that I need to cite. So maybe I'm using something related to number of traffic accidents in each county in Virginia. Well, clearly I didn't collect this data myself. If I did collect the data myself, then I'm fine. I don't have to cite anything. But that data was obtained from a source. And if that data is obtained from a source and then you turn it into a graph or I use it somehow in my project, of course, I need to cite. Okay? So again, just like any other form of plagiarism, when you're using somebody else's work, whether it's their data that you want to do something with, or you want to use a table or a graph of some kind, you have to cite it. The exception would be if I do a survey, if I write my own survey and I deliver the survey to students, and then I compile a table from my own survey. I've done the primary data collection. I don't have anyone to cite. So that would be the exception. If you collect your own data, then we're talking about something different. You're not plagiarizing there because you don't have to cite yourself. So just be careful. Always make sure you're citing your sources. So here's an example. This is a table that somebody else constructed, and it's reasonably organized. It's basically the tax table, so this would be part of our tax code. And note that I have cited the source under the table. So this particular source is the one that kind of put together this tax information. So don't plagiarize by forgetting to cite. Also, an important tip is make sure that your table is large enough to read. A lot of students put these kind of really small tables in, and then it makes it very hard to read them. So make sure you're using good full-size tables. So this is kind of nice. Everyone, even including people in the back of the room, would be able to see this if I'm projecting this in a room. Again, headings, labels, those are all important. Here's another table. So what if this is a table that you constructed? So you're collecting data on tuition, and you've got tuition data for all kinds of schools: Carnegie Mellon, Tulane, Case Western Reserve, University of Richmond, Randolph-Macon, Harvard. But you've constructed the table, and maybe you've collected the data yourself. You still need to give your data source. Of course, I don't want to list every single university website here on this slide, so I'm going to do it in a little bit different way. And you see here that I've put a note at the bottom, and in this case, this is going to be sufficient. I said, table is constructed from data found at each institution's website. So I've basically stated my source. But in other cases, I might need more information. I might need to say this data was collected from the World Bank, or this data was collected from the US Census, available at this location. So perhaps you collected this data from one or two websites. So now I've got states, and I'm looking at the population, percentage of the population that smoked in 2016. Here, I probably need to give the websites because I don't have like 50 different university websites. I'm just kind of collecting data from one or two websites. So below this table, note what I've said here: table constructed using data available at, and I give the website because that's where I went to get the data. So my language is making it clear that I constructed the table because I've said table constructed using data available at, right? My wording is different. So we want to be careful. If I'm using somebody else's table, then you say this table is from. If I'm using somebody else's data to construct my own table, then I say the table is constructed using data from. So again, subtle difference, but it makes it clear to the reader what was my contribution. In this case, the contribution is I made this table myself, but I did use other people's data. Let's move on to talk about figures. Figures are useful. Pie charts, graphs, we use all kinds of things in economics, and they're fantastic because it allows you to communicate a lot of information very efficiently. You can put a lot of data in one graphic. But again, just like with tables, we need to make sure that they're not too complex. We want to make sure that these are readable. You've probably seen graphs that have too many pieces of information in one graph, and it's just hard to figure out what's going on. So first, you need to be clear what's being measured on your graph by clearly defining your axes. And you need to make sure your units of measurement are also clear. Of course, clearly titling is also going to be important. So I should be able to look at a graph that you generate and see what you're measuring, what your axes are, what the units are. Are these dollars? Are these years? Are these parts per million if we're talking about pollution? And you should give it a title. You can use figures from others, as we've already talked about, if you document. So we said if you want to take somebody else's figure and use it, that's fine. Maybe some government website has a great graphic, but you need to say this came from this source. You can also create your own. But if you create your own with somebody else's data, you have to note your data source. So for example, if you use data from the World Bank to make a graph, then you need to cite where that data came from. So here are some examples. These are all examples of figures, and they're all easy to understand and easy to read. And so not all of them have titles because some of the titles have been kind of cut off when we pulled the graphics from various places, but you get the idea. They need to be well laid out, they need to be attractive, they need to be easy to follow. Be sure that the axes are labeled. So in this one, we're looking at billions of dollars. That's on the vertical axis. It tells me the denominations, it's in billions, and year is clearly on the horizontal axis, so everything is labeled. And there's a legend, so we can follow what's going on. At the bottom, we've got the source, and so this came from government website. It's actually the Social Security Administration, and so this is something that they generated, and I might choose to take this and use it in my presentation. If you create your own figure, so this is something that one of my students did. He pulled data to create this figure himself, so we went into Excel and he created it himself, but he's giving the source of the data. So it says below, figure constructed from. That tells the reader, hey, I made the figure myself, but using this data. So figure constructed from data available out at, and he gives the source of where he got data on presidential election turnouts. One thing that I want to be very, very clear about is what you do with your graphs. If you have tables, if you have graphs, do not orphan them. In other words, don't pretend they don't exist. You need to make sure that you treat them as they're real, that they're useful. So don't treat your graph or your table like it's not important. You need to highlight for the reader or the viewer the key takeaways. And so if it appears there, you need to walk us through it. Tell the reader or the viewer of your presentation what's interesting about this graphic. What does the data show us? Don't make the reader or viewer figure this out for himself. I get a lot of students that want to use graphs and they just throw them in their paper. And I'm reading along and all of a sudden I get to this graph and I have no idea why it's there. The author of the paper hasn't told me anything. And so they have completely orphaned the graph. They've acted like it doesn't matter, like it's not important, and they've left it to me to figure out. So bottom line, as it says here on this bullet, don't make the reader or the viewer figure out why you've included that graph. Decide what things are most important to point out and point them out for your reader or for your viewer. For example, here we've got a graph on per capita gross domestic product for 4 countries: Ukraine, Russia, Poland, Denmark. And so if you were to include something like this in your presentation or your paper, you might first make sure the viewer sees that there are 4 nations being compared. So you might say in figure 1, 4 different nations are compared. You might make it clear what's being measured. You're looking at per capita GDP. So we're going to be looking at their gross domestic product on a per person basis. So that's what we're comparing for these 4. And you might point out some of the key takeaways. You might say, from the graph, you can see that Denmark has a significantly higher gross domestic product per capita than the other 3 nations. So that's one kind of important thing you might point out. But you do see a decline after year 2008. That's something else that might be interesting to point out. You might point out that Russia has a lower income, but also kind of shows that same kind of pretty drastic decline, as does Poland. So again, that's what I mean by don't orphan your graphs. If you use a graph, you need to walk the viewer or the reader through why it's there and what it shows them. So let's talk about ways we might use data. We might, in a presentation, decide to talk about something we found. We might say Eric Friedman estimates that education costs would decrease by 23% if education vouchers were used. Well, this might be his research, and he determined from his own models this. The 2000 GDP per capita for Burma is equal to $2,436. And do you note, I've told you where it's coming from, CIA fact book. So in a presentation, if I give data like this, I can cite it right here when I use it. Don't leave the viewer wondering, well, where'd you get that from? The Virginia Department of Education reports average tuition increases of $1,200 last year. Department of Labor reports that wages increased only 2% in 2016. So these are a bunch of different ways that you can kind of give your sources here. One more, Longwood's website states enrollment increased by 80 students. In all of these statements, I can cite them at my last slide, but I've told you my data source as I've given you the data. So Longwood's website states enrollments increase. The Department of Labor reports wages increased. When using data from others, we need to make it clear where we got it. That's important. So indicate it in the sentence or the bullet. A USDA study reports. That's okay. I've told you my source. Now I'm going to give you a bibliographical entry later, but I'm telling you at the time that I'm delivering the data. I can put something in parentheses. I could say I got something from USAID. I can put my source at the bottom of my slide for tables and charts, for example. If I've got more than one statistic from that source, if I'm going to give a list of 5 different statistics, I can put a source under it. So here's an example. A USDA study suggests that The number of family-owned farms decreased by 30% in 2015. Growth in corporate farms has averaged 23%. The number of farm bankruptcies in Virginia for 2016 was 28. Farm commodity prices have fallen for 7 years in a row. And notice at the bottom, I'm telling you the source, Annual Farmers Report, USDA 2016, available at. So it's all there. Again, document your data, but do it in a way that's efficient, and you can give more information on another slide if you need to document a full source. What if I'm orally presenting? So what if I'm doing some kind of talk and there's no visual, there's no slides with it? Well, you still need to give your sources. So if I ask you to give a presentation and there's no handout that you're giving to me, there's no PowerPoint slides, well, you're going to have to communicate them orally as well. So do it in the context of your oral presentation. So maybe I'm delivering a presentation and it's just me talking to the screen, and I say, a 2017 study by the World Bank suggests that the level of extreme poverty has decreased in sub-Saharan Africa. And then I can go on to talk about why this is good or how they've achieved it. But I've told you some data. I haven't given you specifics, but somebody somewhere determined that extreme poverty rates have fallen. And I'm telling you, I got this information from the World Bank. Here's another one. The EPA reports on its website that the volume of household trash has increased by 12% over the past 5 years. That, again, a statistic, a conclusion, and I'm telling you where I got it from, the EPA. The Sierra Club concludes in its annual report that no endangered species were removed from the list last year. So again, a conclusion, kind of data related, and I'm telling you it came from the Sierra Club. Suppose my topic is about making physical education mandatory for 5 days a week in elementary and middle schools. Let's think about how we might use data there. Well, if we're trying to talk about the case for or against making physical education mandatory in middle school and elementary school every single day, well, what kind of data might be useful for us? And let's say we're trying to promote this idea. We want to support this idea, and we want to use data to help make this case. Well, first, I might want to educate the reader. I might want to use some data to provide some background. I might use data to identify problems in society, maybe obesity and health. Maybe I want to identify relevant trends. So maybe something about that we're spending too much time on our iPhones. Maybe we're spending too much time sitting down in front of televisions. Maybe I can use this data to help point out pros and cons of this proposal. And of course, I want to use data to motivate and justify the point that I'm trying to make. So, what might be useful here? Maybe I would start with talking about a lack of activity in youth. I might find data that we spend too much time sitting down, we spend too much time indoors, we spend too much time on electronic devices. That would be background information. I might also want to give the person I'm trying to communicate to data on how physical education requirements have changed over time. So maybe I find data that says, hey, 30 years ago we used to have PE every day, then we went down to 3 times a week, and now we're down to 1 time a week, and that might help motivate the case. Of course, data on childhood obesity rates might really drive it home. If I can show that childhood obesity is a current problem. But I can also look at, adolescent obesity rates and say, look, it's not just children, this is adolescents, it's something they carry into adolescence. What about how obesity rates have changed over time? What if I can paint a picture of a trend, right? Trends are always good to communicate. So maybe we've become fatter over time. Now, I can't say that's only because of not having physical education in elementary school, but certainly that wouldn't help. I can talk about benefits to health. There's got to be some data there. The more physical activity, it reduces the risk of other kinds of problems. Now, I might need to get into some financial stuff. Of course, if we have physical education every single day, maybe that means we need to have more teachers. Maybe there's a concern about expenses for schools. So maybe I need to go in that direction as well. So you get the idea. There's lots of data that we could use to help motivate and justify the point that we're trying to make. Suppose my topic is related to whether or not Longwood University should increase its enrollment. So maybe that's the debate we're having on our campus. Again, we might ask the question, what data would be useful? Well, I might want to know, who are our key competitors now at our current size? Who are our new competitors going to be when we change the size? So if we grow to 7,000, 8,000, 9,000, it changes everything. Who are we going to be competing with then at our larger size? Of course, to answer the questions we just asked, I'm going to have to collect some enrollment data. I'm going to have to report it. Of course, I need to cite that I got the data from various websites. And then, of course, we could look at, again, trends. Trends are always handy. We could look at the trend for Longwood's enrollment over time and get a sense of what that looks like. Now, maybe there's ways for me to take data in another direction by looking at budget issues. Okay, look, let's talk about our enrollment, but remember, enrollment drives budgets. So I could take a look at how budgets have changed over time. Of course, we know that we've had budget cuts. The government has given us less and less money, so I can find data on that. And I can pull all this together to think about the pros and the cons related to the idea of Longwood increasing its enrollment. But again, data is a good way to motivate your point. Now, when you're talking about data, be sure the data is meaningful. It's got to be useful. It's got to provide clarity. Data needs to enhance your points, right? That's the whole reason to use data, to kind of back yourself up, to motivate, to illustrate, and enhance what you're trying to say. But of course, you need to be sure that you use a valid source for data, right? There's nothing worse than trying to use data to validate yourself, but using data that's not accurate, right? That just makes you look like you don't know what you're talking about. So as we've already talked about, going to primary sources is going to be good. And Wikipedia, as we said, is not a primary source. So if I'm really trying to advocate for something, going to Wikipedia doesn't really make me look like I have expertise. Going to primary data and learning as much as I can makes me look like I have much greater expertise and knowledge about what I'm talking about. But one thing I will say about Wikipedia is that they often give primary sources, and so sometimes you might go to Wikipedia just to get the lay of the land and see what you can learn. But again, look at the sources they're using, figure out what primary sources might exist, and then go to those sources. If we're doing a PowerPoint, our last slide of our formal presentation should have our references. So when I ask you to do a formal presentation, make sure that the last thing you give me is a list of your references. Of course, you already know that if you're writing a paper, your references are going to be stated at the end, and it's going to be the same thing for a PowerPoint presentation as well when you're doing a formal presentation. Now, for an informal presentation, it would be a little different. But if you're doing a formal presentation, clearly you need to be very, very careful and make sure those references are clearly identified. Now, for our particular purposes, I don't care what format you use for your references. In my classes, people have all kinds of different knowledge. They have different disciplines. My discipline uses a different format probably than they use in English. So I would suggest you use whatever format you're comfortable with, whatever you've been trained for in your particular major. And again, for oral presentations, as we've said, but I want to remind you again, when you don't have any PowerPoint slides, when you're just speaking to the camera, you need to make sure you've communicated sources as part of your discussion. So again, the World Bank's report on aging states that blah, 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 blah. You get the idea. All right. If you have any questions at all, of course, email me. And as we get into the point of doing some presentations, I know you're going to want to go back and take another quick look at this presentation to refresh yourself. And of course, if you have specific issues and you don't quite know how to handle them, just let me know and we'll get it figured out. So I hope that was clear. Of course, anything that wasn't, let me know and I'll get right back to you. Thank you so much for listening and have a fantastic day.